My hands were still trembling as I held the glossy white card, the elegant gold lettering swimming before my tear-blurred eyes. The morning sunlight streaming through Brian's bedroom window seemed to mock me, illuminating every cruel detail of what I just discovered beneath his bed while cleaning. Brian Pedro Hendris and Sophia Elizabeth Hartwell request the honor of your presence at their wedding ceremony. Saturday, October 14, 2025. St. Mary's Cathedral. 2 days. 2 days from now. My heart hammered against my ribs so violently I thought it might burst. The blood in my veins turned to ice water as the reality crashed over me like a tidal wave. 4 years. 4 years of my life of cooking his meals, cleaning his apartment, waiting patiently for him to set a date for our own wedding. 4 years of believing I was his one and only. The card slipped from my numb fingers, fluttering to the hardwood floor like a dying butterfly. Behind me, I heard the front door open and close, followed by Brian's footsteps. He appeared in the bedroom doorway. My throat felt raw, as if I'd been screaming though I hadn't made a sound. I turned slowly, the wedding invitation clutched against my chest like evidence of a crime. Brian's eyes met mine, and for a moment, confusion flickered across his handsome face. Then his gaze dropped to the card in my hands and something cold and calculating replaced the confusion. Brian, my voice came out as barely a whisper, broken and desperate. What is this? Before we continue, please write in the comment which country you are watching this video. We love knowing where our global family is tuning in from. And if this is your first time on this channel, please subscribe. Your support helps us bring even more epic revenge tales of life. Enjoy listening. My name is Claire Martin, and until that morning, I thought I knew exactly who I was and where my life was heading. I was 26 years old, working double shifts at Moonbeam Coffee on 5th Street, saving every penny I could for the wedding I'd been dreaming about since Brian first slipped a simple silver ring onto my finger 3 years ago. The ring wasn't much. He'd apologize for that, promising something better when we actually got married. But I didn't care about diamonds or gold. I cared about the promise it represented, the future we were building together one day at a time. Brian was everything I'd never dared to hope for. Tall and confident with dark hair that always fell perfectly across his forehead. He had this way of making me feel like I was the only woman in the world when he looked at me. He worked in finance downtown, wore expensive suits, and drove a sleek black BMW that made my beat-up Honda look like a toy car in comparison. We'd met 4 years ago when he'd wandered into Moonbeam during a particularly brutal rainstorm. I was working the evening shift and the cafe was nearly empty except for a few students hunched over laptops. He'd ordered a simple black coffee and sat by the window scrolling through his phone with an intensity that made me curious. When I brought him his coffee, he'd looked up and smiled. Really smiled. Not the polite customer service smile I was used to receiving. "You have beautiful eyes," he'd said simply. And I'd felt my cheeks burn with a blush that probably made me look like a tomato. That was Brian's gift. He could make you feel special with just a few words. A certain look, a gentle touch on your arm. Within a month, we were inseparable. Within 6 months, I was spending most nights at his downtown apartment. A sleek, modern space that felt like something out of a magazine compared to my tiny studio across town. I should have noticed the signs earlier. The way he never wanted to talk about wedding dates, always saying soon or when the time is right. How he changed the subject whenever I brought up meeting his family or friends. The mysterious phone calls he'd take in the other room, speaking in hushed tones. The weekends when he'd disappear for work conferences that seemed to happen awfully frequently. But love makes you blind, doesn't it? Love makes you explain away the inconsistencies. Fill in the gaps with hope instead of logic. I told myself he was just private, just focused on his career. I told myself that when he was ready, when he felt secure enough financially, we'd have the wedding of my dreams. Every morning I'd wake up in his king-size bed and watch him get ready for work, marveling at how lucky I was. I'd make him coffee the way he liked it, 2 sugars, splash of cream, and pack him lunch in the expensive containers he preferred. I cleaned his apartment while he was at work, doing his laundry, organizing his closets, making sure everything was perfect for when he came home. My friends thought I was crazy. Angela, my best friend since high school, would roll her eyes whenever I talked about Brian. "Clara, you're basically his unpaid housekeeper," she'd say. "When was the last time he did something nice for you? When was the last time he even took you out somewhere fancy? But Angela didn't understand. She didn't see the way Brian would pull me close when we watched movies, or how he'd trace patterns on my back when he thought I was asleep. She didn't hear the way he'd whisper, "I love you," into my hair on quiet Sunday mornings. She didn't know about the promises he'd made, the life we were planning together. Or so I thought. The night before I found the wedding card, Brian had been different, restless. He'd paced around the apartment, checking his phone constantly, barely touching the dinner I'd spent 2 hours preparing. When I'd asked if everything was okay, he'd snapped at me for the first time in months. "Not everything is about you, Clara," he'd said, his voice sharp with irritation. "I have important things to deal with." I'd apologized immediately, the way I always did when tension arose between us. I'd cleaned up dinner in silence while he made phone calls in his study, the door firmly closed. When I'd finally gone to bed, he was still up, the blue glow of his laptop screen visible under the door crack. I should have known. God, I should have known. I woke up alone that Saturday morning, which wasn't unusual. Brian often got up early on weekends to go to the gym or handle work calls. The apartment was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic from the street below. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long rectangles of gold across the polished hardwood floors. I stretched lazily, enjoying the luxury of sleeping in. My shift at Moonbeam didn't start until noon, which gave me plenty of time to tidy up the apartment and maybe surprise Brian with his favorite breakfast when he got back from wherever he'd gone. The kitchen was spotless. I'd made sure of that the night before, so I decided to tackle the bedroom. Brian was particular about cleanliness, and I'd learned early in our relationship that keeping his space immaculate was one of the ways I could show him I cared. I stripped the bed and gathered the sheets for washing, then got down on my hands and knees to retrieve a sock that had somehow ended up under the bed. That's when I saw it. A corner of white paper peeking out from beneath the far edge of the mattress, almost hidden by the bed frame. At first I thought it might be a bill or some work document that had fallen. Brian was always bringing paperwork home, leaving it scattered around the apartment before eventually filing it away in his study. I reached for it, expecting to find a bank statement or insurance form. Instead, my fingers closed around thick, expensive cardstock, the kind of paper used for important announcements, wedding invitations. My heart skipped a beat as I pulled it free, and for a moment, I felt a flutter of excitement. Maybe this was it. Maybe Brian had been planning a surprise. Maybe he'd finally ordered our wedding invitations and hidden them to keep the details secret until he was ready to reveal everything. But as I turned the card over and read the elegant script, the world seemed to tilt sideways. Brian Pedro Hendris and Sophia Elizabeth Hartwell. The names swam before my eyes as my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. This wasn't our wedding invitation. This was someone else's. Some woman named Sophia Elizabeth Hartwell was marrying my Brian in 2 days, and I was just finding out about it by accident while cleaning his bedroom. My hands began to shake so violently that I nearly dropped the card. I read it again, hoping I'd misunderstood, hoping this was some kind of mistake or cruel joke. But there it was in black and white, or rather gold lettering on cream-colored cardstock. The ceremony was scheduled for Saturday, October 14th at 2 p.m. Today was October 12th. 2 days. In 2 days, the man I'd been living with for 4 years, the man who'd promised to marry me, the man I'd built my entire future around was going to walk down the aisle with someone else. I sank back on my heels, the invitation clutched against my chest as if it could somehow protect me from the truth it contained. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Who was Sophia Elizabeth Hartwell? How long had Brian known her? How long had he been planning this wedding while lying to my face every single day? The questions came in a torrent, each one more painful than the last. Had he been seeing her the entire time we'd been together? Was I just some kind of placeholder, a convenient arrangement while he pursued his real relationship? All those work conferences, all those mysterious phone calls, all those times he'd been distant and distracted. Had he been with her? I thought about all the times I'd asked about our wedding, all the times he'd deflected or changed the subject. Soon he'd always said, "When the time is right." Meanwhile, he'd been planning a completely different wedding with a completely different woman. The betrayal cut through me like a physical wound, sharp and deep and breathtaking in its cruelty. I'd given him everything, my time, my energy, my love, my trust. I'd rearranged my entire life around his schedule, his preferences, his needs. I turned down job opportunities that would have required me to move. Declined invitations from friends because he preferred quiet nights in. Even changed the way I dressed because he'd mentioned once that he preferred women who looked classic rather than trendy. And for what? To be discarded like yesterday's newspaper while he married someone else. I heard the front door open and close, followed by Brian's familiar footsteps in the hallway. He was back from wherever he'd gone, probably expecting to find me making breakfast or doing laundry like the beautiful girlfriend I'd always been. Instead, he was going to find me holding the evidence of his deception. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. The wedding invitation felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in my hands. Part of me wanted to put it back where I'd found it, to pretend I'd never seen it, to go on living in the comfortable lie I'd been inhabiting for who knows how long. But I couldn't. The truth was out now and there was no putting it back. Clara Bryan's voice drifted down the hallway, casual and unsuspecting. You up yet? I brought coffee from that place you like? I couldn't answer. My throat felt like it had closed up completely. And even if I could have spoken, I wouldn't have known what to say. How do you confront someone about a betrayal this massive? How do you even begin to address a lie this elaborate? His footsteps grew closer and then he appeared in the bedroom doorway holding 2 paper cups from Moonbeam Coffee. He was wearing his gym clothes, black athletic shorts and a fitted t-shirt that showed off the physique he worked so hard to maintain. His dark hair was slightly messed from his workout, and there was a light sheen of sweat on his forehead. He looked so normal, so familiar. So much like the man I'd fallen in love with that for a moment. I almost convinced myself this was all some terrible misunderstanding. Then his eyes found mine and I saw the exact moment he noticed the card in my hands. His expression shifted from casual affection to something I'd never seen before. A cold, calculating look that made him seem like a complete stranger. What's that? He asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. I held up the invitation with trembling hands. You tell me, Brian, what is this? He set the coffee cups down on his dresser with deliberate care, buying himself time to think. When he turned back to me, the mask had slipped completely. The warm, loving man I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone who looked at me like I was an inconvenience he needed to handle. Where did you find that? His voice was flat, emotionless. Under your bed. My voice cracked on the words while I was cleaning like I always do, like the good little girlfriend I've been for 4 years. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd always found endearing, but now seemed calculated and cold. Clara, listen. No. The word came out stronger than I'd expected. You listen. I want you to explain to me how you're marrying someone named Sophia in 2 days when you've been telling me for 3 years that we're going to get married soon. Brian's jaw tightened and for a moment I thought he might actually try to explain, might offer some excuse or apology that could somehow make this make sense. Instead he laughed, a short bitter sound that made my blood run cold. Did you really think I'd marry someone like you? The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually took a step backward as if he'd slapped me. What? Come on, Claire. Be realistic. He gestured around the expensive apartment, then at me in my worn pajamas and messy hair. Look at this place. Look at my life. Did you honestly believe I'd tie myself down to a coffee shop girl who can barely make rent? Each word was like a knife twisting in my chest. But he said you loved me. You said I said what you needed to hear. His voice was matter of fact, as if he were discussing the weather. You were convenient, Clara. You cooked. You cleaned. You were always available when I needed companionship. But marriage, a real future, that was never going to happen. I stared at him. This man I'd shared a bed with for 4 years. This man I'd planned my entire future around and realized I'd never known him at all. Who is she? Sophia, someone appropriate. He straightened his shoulders and I could see him slipping into the confident, successful persona he wore at work. Someone from my world. Her father owns 3 hotels downtown, and she has a master's degree from Columbia. She's the kind of woman a man like me marries. And what am I? The smile that crossed his face was cruel and cold. You're the kind of woman a man like me keeps around until he finds someone better. The room spun around me for years. 4 years of believing I was building something real, something lasting. 4 years of turning down other opportunities, other relationships, Other possibilities because I thought I'd found my person. 4 years of being nothing more than a placeholder. I loved you, I whispered and hated how broken I sounded. No, you loved the idea of me. Brian moved to his closet and began pulling out clothes as if this conversation was already over. You loved the fantasy of marrying up, of escaping your little coffee shop life. But that was never reality, Clara. That was never going to be reality. I looked down at the wedding invitation still clutched in my hands, at the elegant script announcing his marriage to someone else, someone worthy, someone appropriate, someone who wasn't me. Get out, he said without looking at me. I need to get ready. I have a bachelor party tonight. A bachelor party? While I'd been planning our imaginary future, he'd been celebrating his real one with his real friends, preparing to marry his real fiancé, the woman he'd chosen, the woman who deserved him. I stumbled toward the door, my legs barely supporting me. At the threshold, I turned back one last time, hoping to see some flicker of remorse, some sign that our 4 years together had meant something to him. Instead, I found him checking his phone, already moving on to whatever came next in his carefully planned life. A life that had never included me as anything more than a temporary convenience. Clara, he called out just as I reached the hallway. I turned, hope fluttering stupidly in my chest. Leave your key on the kitchen counter on your way out. I don't remember leaving Brian's apartment or driving home. The next thing I knew, I was sitting on the floor of my tiny studio, still in my pajamas, sobbing so hard I could barely breathe. The wedding invitation lay beside me like evidence of a crime, its elegant lettering blurred by my tears. My phone buzzed with a text from my manager at Moonbeam, asking if I was coming in for my shift. I stared at the message for a long time before typing back that I was sick. It wasn't a lie. I felt like I was dying from the inside out. The walls of my small apartment seemed to close in around me as the full weight of my situation hit. I had no savings to speak of because I'd been putting every extra penny toward our wedding fund. I had no backup plan because my entire future had been built around Brian and our life together. I had no other relationships to fall back on because I'd let most of my friendships fade, choosing to spend my free time with him instead. I was 26 years old and I had nothing to show for the last 4 years except a broken heart and a pile of lies. The crying came in waves, each one more devastating than the last. I cried for the wedding I'd never have, for the future that had been stolen from me, for the naive girl who'd believed that love was enough. But mostly I cried for the humiliation of it all. The knowledge that while I'd been playing house, he'd been planning a real life with someone else. My phone rang, jolting me out of my spiral. Angela's name flashed on the screen and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. I didn't want to admit what had happened. Didn't want to see the pity in her eyes when she realized how completely I'd been fooled. But I needed someone. Anyone. Hey girl. Angela's tearful voice filled the silence. Want to grab lunch? I'm craving those tacos from Clara. Are you crying? The concern in her voice broke something loose inside me and the whole story came pouring out. I told her about finding the wedding invitation, about Brian's cruel words, about the 4 years I'd wasted on a man who'd never seen me as anything more than a convenience. Angela listened without interrupting, and when I finally finished, the silence stretched between us for a long moment. That bastard, she said finally, her voice tight with fury. That absolute piece of garbage. Angela, I'm so stupid. You tried to warn me and I stopped. Her voice was firm. You're not stupid. You're not naive. You're not any of the things he made you feel. You loved someone and he took advantage of that love. That makes him a monster, not you a fool. I wiped my nose with the back of my hand, feeling slightly less alone. What am I supposed to do now? He's getting married in 2 days, and I'm sitting here in my pajamas crying over a man who never loved me. First, you're going to get up and take a shower, Angela said. Then you're going to eat something. Then we're going to figure out how to make him pay for what he did to you. Angela, I can't what? Can't stand up for yourself. Can't demand justice. Claire, this man stole 4 years of your life. He lied to you every single day. He made you believe you were building a future together while he was planning to marry someone else. You think you're just going to let him ride off into the sunset with his perfect bride while you sit here broken? Something in her voice sparked a flame in my chest. Small but growing stronger. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that Brian Pedro Hendris is about to learn that actions have consequences. I'm suggesting that his perfect wedding day might not go exactly as planned. The flame grew brighter. Angela, I can't crash his wedding. That's crazy. Is it? Is it crazier than what he did to you? Claire, this man destroyed you. He threw away 4 years of your life like it meant nothing. He called you a coffee shop girl like that was something to be ashamed of. He made you feel small and worthless and disposable. Each word hit home, stoking the fire that was building inside me. Angela was right. I had been destroyed, but I didn't have to stay that way. Besides, Angela continued, don't you think his bride-to-be deserves to know what kind of man she's marrying? Don't you think she has a right to know that he's been living with another woman for 4 years? I thought about Sophia Elizabeth Hartwell, this woman I'd never met who was about to make the same mistake I had. Did she know about me? Was she as clueless as I'd been? Or was she complicit in this deception? I need to think about this, I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I could feel my resolve hardening. Don't think too long, Angela said. The wedding is in 2 days. If we're going to do something, we need to move fast. After we hung up, I sat in the silence of my apartment, the wedding invitation still lying beside me on the floor. Brian's words echoed in my head. You're the kind of woman a man like me keeps around until he finds someone better. But maybe he was wrong. Maybe I wasn't the kind of woman who disappeared quietly when she was no longer wanted. Maybe I was the kind of woman who fought back. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found my brother Clayton's number. If I was going to do this, I was going to need backup. Clayton, it's Clara. I need your help with something, and it's going to sound crazy, but I need you to trust me. By the time I finished explaining the situation, my brother's voice was tight with barely controlled rage. Clara, I'm going to kill that bastard. No, you're not. But you are going to help me make sure his wedding day is one he'll never forget. Whatever you need, sis. Whatever you need. I called Angela back, then my cousin Stephanie, then my friend Ben from work. One by one, I assembled a small army of people who loved me. People who were outraged on my behalf. People who were ready to stand with me when I faced Brian again because I was going to face him again. Not as the broken, humiliated woman who'd left his apartment that morning, but as someone who refused to be discarded without a fight. The wedding was in 2 days. That gave me 48 hours to plan to prepare to transform my heartbreak into something more powerful. Revenge. St. Mary's Cathedral stood like a fortress of white stone against the October sky. Its Gothic spires reaching toward heaven, as if seeking divine blessing for the union about to take place within its walls. Cars lined the street. Expensive cars, the kind that spoke of old money and established families. Mercedes, BMWs, a few Teslas, and even a Bentley parked near the front steps. I sat in Angela's Honda Civic across the street, watching the guests arrive in their designer dresses and tailored suits. These were Brian's people. I realized his real people. The ones he'd never introduced me to in 4 years because I didn't belong in their world. You sure about this? Angela asked from the driver's seat. She was dressed in a simple black dress that could pass for wedding appropriate, her dark hair pulled back in an elegant bun. Beside her, my brother Clayton adjusted his tie nervously. He'd borrowed a suit from his roommate, and while it didn't fit perfectly, he looked respectable enough to blend in with the crowd. I'm sure, I said, though my hands were shaking as I checked my reflection in the visor mirror one last time. I'd spent the last 2 days preparing for this moment. Not just emotionally but practically. I'd gone shopping with Angela, using the last of my savings to buy a dress that would help me fit in among Brian's crowd. A navy blue sheath dress that was simple but elegant paired with heels that made me 3 inches taller, and infinitely more confident. More importantly, I'd done my research. A few strategic phone calls to mutual acquaintances, some careful social media stalking, and a conversation with Brian's chatty neighbor had given me everything I needed to know about Sophia Elizabeth Hartwell and her family. She was 24, a recent graduate of Columbia Business School, and the daughter of Ricardo Hartwell, who owned a chain of boutique hotels throughout the Northeast. She was beautiful in the way that money could make you beautiful. Perfect teeth, perfect hair, perfect everything. She was also, according to her Instagram account, completely unaware that her fiancé had been living with another woman for the past 4 years. Remember the plan I set to my small crew? Angela and Clayton would enter first, blending in with the other guests. My cousin Stephanie and her boyfriend Mike were already inside, having arrived early to scout the layout. Ben from work was stationed outside with his camera, ready to document whatever happened next. "We've got your back," Clayton said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "That bastard is going to get exactly what he deserves." I watched as more guests filed into the cathedral, their laughter and chatter drifting across the street. Somewhere in there, Brian was probably adjusting his tie and checking his watch, counting down the minutes until he could officially close the door on the Clara chapter of his life. He had no idea that chapter wasn't over yet. At 1:45, 15 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, I saw her. Sophia Elizabeth Hartwell stepped out of a white Rolls-Royce, and even from across the street, she was breathtaking. Her wedding dress was a masterpiece of silk and lace that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. Her veil flowed behind her like a cloud, and her smile was radiant as she waved to the photographers who'd gathered to capture her perfect day. She looked happy, genuinely, completely happy, and for a moment I almost lost my nerve. But then I remembered Brian's words. "You're the kind of woman a man like me keeps around until he finds someone better." I remembered the casual cruelty in his voice, the way he dismissed 4 years of my life like it meant nothing. Sophia deserved to know what kind of man she was marrying, and Brian deserved to face the consequences of his lies. "It's time," I said. We crossed the street together, my small army of supporters flanking me as we approached the cathedral steps. The massive wooden doors stood open, and I could hear the soft murmur of conversation from inside, punctuated by the gentle notes of a string quartet. The sanctuary was even more impressive than I'd expected. Soaring ceilings, stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns across the stone floor, and enough flowers to stock a small garden center. White roses and peonies adorned every surface, their sweet fragrance filling the air. The guests were seated in neat rows, their attention focused on the altar where Brian stood waiting. He looked handsome in his black tuxedo, his dark hair perfectly styled, his posture confident and relaxed. This was his moment, his perfect day, his carefully orchestrated transition from one life to the next. I slipped into a pew near the back, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. Angela sat beside me, her hand finding mine and squeezing tight. Clayton took the seat on my other side, his jaw clenched with barely controlled anger. The music changed, signaling the start of the processional. Bridesmaids in pale pink dresses began their slow walk down the aisle, followed by flower girls scattering rose petals. The guests rose to their feet as the wedding march began, and all eyes turned toward the back of the church. Sophia appeared in the doorway, her arm linked with her father's. She was even more beautiful up close, her face glowing with joy and anticipation. She had no idea that her perfect day was about to become a nightmare. As she began her walk down the aisle, I stood up. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the cathedral. The music stopped abruptly. Heads turned in my direction, confusion rippling through the crowd like a wave. Sophia paused halfway down the aisle, her brow furrowed as she tried to understand what was happening. Brian's face went white as he spotted me. For a moment our eyes met across the crowded sanctuary, and I saw fear flicker in his gaze. Good. He should be afraid. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I continued, stepping into the aisle. "But there's something everyone needs to know before this ceremony continues." "Security." Brian's voice cracked as he called out, but the cathedral's security was minimal. Just an elderly usher who looked more confused than threatening. "My name is Clara Martin," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "And for the past 4 years I've been living with the groom." Gasps echoed through the sanctuary. Sophia's bouquet slipped from her hands, white roses scattering across the stone floor. Her father's face turned purple with rage, while her mother clutched her pearls like they might protect her from this scandal. "That's a lie," Brian shouted from the altar, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, scrolling to the photos I'd prepared. "These are pictures of us together at his apartment, the apartment where I've been living, cooking his meals, doing his laundry, and planning our wedding for the past 4 years. I held up the phone showing a selfie of Brian and me from just last month. We were in his kitchen, his arms wrapped around me from behind, both of us smiling at the camera. It was one of dozens of similar photos I had documenting a relationship that Brian was now trying to pretend had never existed. He told me we were going to get married, I continued, my voice carrying to every corner of the cathedral. He gave me a ring. He made promises. And 2 days ago, I found your wedding invitation hidden under his bed while I was cleaning his apartment. Sophia's face crumpled and she sank onto a nearby pew. As the full weight of what I was saying hit her, her bridesmaids rushed to her side, their pink dresses a stark contrast to the white roses scattered around their feet. You want to know what he said when I confronted him? I asked, turning to address the crowd directly. He said I was just a coffee shop girl who wasn't good enough for him. He said I was convenient. He said I was the kind of woman a man like him keeps around until he finds someone better. The sanctuary erupted in whispers and shocked exclamations. Some guests were already reaching for their phones, no doubt preparing to share this drama with their social media followers. Others were standing up, preparing to leave this disaster of a wedding. Sophia, I called out, my voice gentler now. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here because you deserve to know the truth about the man you're about to marry. You deserve to know that he's been lying to both of us. Sophia looked up at me, tears streaming down her face, her perfect makeup ruined. Is it true? She whispered, but her question wasn't directed at me. All eyes turned to Brian, who stood frozen at the altar like a deer caught in headlights. The confident, successful man I'd fallen in love with was gone, replaced by someone who looked small and desperate and caught. Brian. Sophia's voice was stronger now, carrying clearly through the silent cathedral. Is it true? For a long moment Brian said nothing. He stood at the altar in his perfect tuxedo, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, filled only by Sophia's quiet sobs and the distant sound of traffic from the street outside. Finally he found his voice. Sophia, I can explain. Explain what? Her father's voice boomed through the cathedral as he strode down the aisle, his face red with fury. Explain how you've been living with another woman while engaged to my daughter. Explain how you've made a mockery of our family. Mr. Hartwell, please, if you'll just listen. I've heard enough. Ricardo Hartwell's voice was ice cold. Security. I want this man removed from my daughter's wedding immediately. But before anyone could move, Brian's panic took over completely. You can't do this to me, he shouted, pointing an accusing finger at me. She's lying. She's a crazy ex-girlfriend who can't accept that it's over. She's trying to ruin my life. His voice echoed off the stone walls, desperate and shrill. Call the police. She's trespassing. She's disrupting a private ceremony. She's telling the truth. The quiet voice came from the back of the cathedral, and every head turned to see who had spoken. A woman in her 50s stood in the doorway, her silver hair perfectly styled, her expression grim. She was elegant in the way that only comes with old money and good breeding, and she carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Mother. Brian's voice cracked like a teenager's. Mrs. Hicks, Brian's mother, whom I'd never met in 4 years of dating her son, walked slowly down the aisle, her heels clicking against the stone floor. I've been trying to reach you for weeks, Brian. Ever since I found out about this wedding from the society pages. She stopped in front of Sophia, her expression softening slightly. My dear, I'm so sorry you had to find out this way. But yes, everything this young woman has said is true. My son has been living with her for years. I've seen the pictures on his social media, though he was always careful not to tag her or mention her name. Brian's face went from white to green. Mother, you don't understand. Oh, I understand perfectly. Mrs. Hicks's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. I understand that you've been lying to everyone, including me. I understand that you've been stringing along 2 women, making promises you never intended to keep. And I understand that you're exactly like your father. The last words hit Brian like a physical blow. He actually staggered backward, his hand gripping the altar rail for support. Mrs. Hendricks turned to address the stunned congregation, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades navigating high society scandals. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disruption, but I cannot in good conscience allow this ceremony to proceed. My son has committed fraud, emotional fraud against both of these women. She reached into her purse and pulled out a thick manila envelope, Brian, you might be interested to know that I've spent the last month having you investigated. Professional curiosity, you might say. After I started noticing discrepancies in your stories, Brian's face went ashen. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that you've been embezzling money from your company to fund this elaborate lifestyle you've been living. Mrs. Hicks's voice was steady, but I could see the pain in her eyes. I'm talking about the forged documents also taking money from my account without my knowledge. The falsified expense reports, the client accounts you've been skimming from. The cathedral erupted in shocked whispers. Sophia's father stepped forward, his face thunderous. What is she saying, Brian? I'm saying, Mrs. Hicks continued, that my son is not only a liar and a cheat, but also a thief. And I'm saying that I've already turned all the evidence over to the authorities. As if summoned by her words, the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer by the second. Brian's head whipped toward the cathedral doors, his eyes wide with panic. You called the police on your own son? Sophia's mother gasped, her hand pressed to her chest. I called them on a criminal, Mrs. Hendricks replied coldly. The fact that he happens to be my son is irrelevant. Actions have consequences, and Brian has spent years avoiding his. The sirens were louder now, and through the open cathedral doors, I could see the flash of red and blue lights. Brian looked around wildly, like a trapped animal, searching for an escape route. This is insane, he shouted. You're all insane, Sophia. Tell them this is our wedding day. Tell them what, Brian? Sophia's voice was quiet but deadly. She stood up slowly, her wedding dress rustling around her like armor. Tell them that I want to marry a man who's been living with another woman. Tell them that I want to spend my life with someone who's been stealing money from his own mother and business clients, and lying to everyone who trusted him. She walked toward him, her steps measured and deliberate. When she reached the altar, she looked up at him with eyes that held no trace of the love that had been there just minutes before. Tell me something, Brian, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent cathedral. Did you ever love me? Or was I just another convenient arrangement like Clara was? Brian opened his mouth, but no words came out. The answer was written all over his face. Sophia nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. Then, without warning, her hand flew through the air and connected with his cheek in a slap that echoed off the stone walls like a gunshot. That's for Clara, she said. Then she slapped him again even harder. And that's for me. The police officers appeared in the doorway just as Brian stumbled backward from the force of Sophia's second slap. They moved down the aisle with professional efficiency, their presence transforming the sacred space into a crime scene. Brian Pedro Hendricks. The lead officer's voice was calm and authoritative. Yes, Brian whispered, all the fight gone out of him. You're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and theft. You have the right to remain silent. As the officer read Brian his rights, the cathedral began to empty. Guests fled toward the exits, some stopping to offer awkward condolences to Sophia and her family. Others simply eager to escape the scandal that would undoubtedly be front-page news in tomorrow's society papers. I stood frozen in my pew, watching as the man I'd loved for 4 years was handcuffed and led away. This wasn't how I'd imagined this moment would go. I'd wanted justice, yes, but I'd never expected it to be this swift, this complete, this devastating. Clara Sophia's voice was soft, and I turned to find her standing beside my pew. Up close, I could see that she was younger than I'd thought, probably closer to 22 than 24. Her wedding dress was wrinkled now. Her veil askew, her makeup strewn with tears. I'm sorry, I said the words feeling inadequate. I'm sorry your wedding day was ruined. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. She shook her head. Don't apologize. You saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life. She paused, studying my face. How long did you say you were with him? For years. 4 years. She repeated, her voice filled with wonder and horror. 4 years of your life wasted on him. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry too, I said. For both of us. We stood there for a moment. 2 women who'd been betrayed by the same man. United in our shared pain and our mutual escape from a future that would have destroyed us both. What will you do now? Sophia asked. I looked around the cathedral at the scattered rose petals and abandoned programs at the altar where Brian had stood just minutes before, confident in his deception. I don't know, I admitted. Start over, I guess. Figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be what someone else wants me to be. Sophia nodded. Me too. 6 months later, I stood behind the counter at Moonbeam Coffee, but everything was different now. The cafe had new owners. Angela and I had pulled our resources and bought it from the previous owner who was ready to retire. We'd painted the walls a warm sage green, added comfortable seating areas, and expanded the menu to include fresh pastries that I baked every morning. The bell above the door chimed, and I looked up to see Sophia walk in. She'd cut her hair short since the wedding that never was, and she looked younger, freer, more like herself. She'd become a regular customer over the past few months, and what had started as awkward encounters had gradually evolved into something resembling friendship. The usual, I asked, already reaching for a cup. Actually, make it two, she said, smiling. I have news. I prepared her lavender latte in my own coffee, then joined her at our favorite table by the window. Outside, spring was beginning to show itself in the form of tiny green buds on the trees that lined the street. So, I said, settling into my chair. What's the news? I got the job, she said, her eyes bright with excitement. The nonprofit in Portland. I start next month, Sophia. That's amazing. I reached across the table to squeeze her hand. You're going to love it there. After the wedding disaster, Sophia had taken some time to figure out what she really wanted to do with her life, rather than what her family expected her to do. She discovered a passion for environmental conservation and had been applying to organizations across the country. What about you? She asked. Any word on the business loan? I grinned. Approved. Angela and I are going to open a second location downtown. It had taken months of planning and paperwork, but we were finally ready to expand. The new cafe would be bigger with space for live music and community events. It was everything I dreamed of, but had never dared to pursue while I was waiting for Brian to decide my future for me. I'm so proud of you, Sophia said, and I could tell she meant it. You've built something amazing here. We both have, I said. We've built ourselves back up. It was true. The months following the wedding had been difficult for both of us. There had been therapy sessions and sleepless nights, moments of doubt and waves of anger. But there had also been growth, discovery, and the gradual realization that we were both stronger than we'd ever imagined. Brian, meanwhile, had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for embezzlement. His mother had testified against him at the trial, her testimony delivered with the same cold precision she'd shown at the cathedral. She'd visited me once, a few weeks after his sentencing, to apologize for her son's behavior, and to thank me for having the courage to speak up. He was always entitled, she'd said, sitting in the same cafe, looking older and more fragile than she had that day at the cathedral. I thought marriage might change him, might give him something to be responsible for. I was wrong. I'd felt sorry for her then, this elegant woman who'd lost her son not to death, but to his own choices. But I'd also felt grateful that she'd chosen justice over family loyalty when it mattered most. Have you heard from him? Sophia asked now as if reading my thoughts. I shook my head. No, and I don't want to. That chapter of my life is closed. It was true. In the beginning, I'd been angry, furious at Brian for the lies at myself for believing them at the 4 years I'd lost. But anger was exhausting, and eventually I'd chosen to channel that energy into building something better. But Faye was thriving. I'd started dating again. Nothing serious yet, but I was learning to trust my instincts and to value myself enough to walk away from anyone who didn't treat me with respect. I'd reconnected with old friends and made new ones. I discovered that I was actually quite good at running a business, at making decisions, at being the protagonist of my own story instead of a supporting character in someone else's. I should go, Sophia said, checking her watch. I have a million things to do before the move. Keep in touch, I said, hugging her goodbye. And remember, you always have a place to stay if you're ever back in town. Same to you if you're ever in Portland, she replied. After she left, I stood at the window watching her walk down the street, her steps confident and purposeful. She'd found her path just as I'd found mine. We'd both emerged from Brian's deception, stronger and more self-aware than we'd been before. The bell chimed again and Angela walked in, her arms full of flowers from the farmer's market. How'd it go with the loan officer? She asked. We got it, I said, unable to keep the grin off my face. Angela let out a whoop of joy and spun around, sending flower petals flying through the air. We did it. We actually did it. We did. I agreed, laughing as I helped her gather the scattered flowers. As we arranged the blooms and vases around the cafe, I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago, broken, humiliated, convinced that my worth was tied to whether or not a man chose to marry me. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone I'd known once but had outgrown. The truth was, Brian had done me a favor, though I'd never thank him for it. His betrayal had shattered the small safe world I'd built around his approval, forcing me to discover who I was when I wasn't trying to be what someone else wanted. And who I was, it turned out, was someone worth knowing, someone worth loving, someone who could build a business, maintain friendships, and create a life that was entirely her own. The afternoon sun streamed through the cafe windows, illuminating the flowers Angela had arranged, casting everything in a warm golden light. Customers began to filter in for the evening rush. Regulars who knew my name, who asked about my day, who'd become part of the community we'd built here. This was my life now. Not the life I'd planned when I was 22 and thought love meant sacrifice, but the life I'd chosen when I learned that love, real love, meant growth. My phone buzzed with a text from Clayton. Saw the news about the loan. So proud of you, sis. Mom and Dad would be too. I smiled, thinking of my parents who'd passed away when I was in college before I'd met Brian. They'd raised me to be independent, to chase my dreams, to never settle for less than I deserved. Somehow, in the fog of first love, I'd forgotten those lessons. But I remembered them now. As the evening wore on and the cafe filled with the comfortable buzz of conversation and laughter, I realized something that would have shocked the woman I'd been 6 months ago. I was happy. Not the desperate, clinging happiness that depended on someone else's choices, but the deep, steady contentment that came from building a life I was proud of. Brian had thought he was marrying his dream girl while discarding his nightmare. But he'd been wrong about that, just as he'd been wrong about so many things. He'd thought I was the kind of woman who would disappear quietly when she was no longer wanted. Instead, I'd become the kind of woman who fought back, who demanded justice, who refused to be erased. He thought his perfect wedding day would be the beginning of his perfect life. Instead, it had been the beginning of his downfall. Me, I thought his betrayal would destroy me. Instead, it had set me free. As I locked up the cafe that night, I caught my reflection in the window. The woman looking back at me was confident, successful, surrounded by people who valued her for who she was rather than what she could provide. She was everything the scared, heartbroken girl from 6 months ago had never dared to dream she could become. Brian had been right about one thing. I wasn't the kind of woman a man like him married. I was better than that. I was the kind of woman who married herself first, who built her own dreams, who created her own happily ever after. And that I realized as I walked home through the spring evening was the best revenge of